Every year, the Helmholtz Association honors 6 of their researchers by awarding them the Helmholtz Doctoral Prize. And this year, they asked me whether I'd like to go and visit them and introduce them to you, which, of course, I would. Let's go and meet them. So here at the MDC in Berlin is where Katrina did her PhD work. So what is it that you researched?
I researched disease mechanisms.
Disease mechanisms?
We know the genes that cause disease, but we actually don't know how they cause disease.
The thing is, mutations in genes can lead to errors in the proteins that they code for. And during a mass spectrometry screen, in the midst of all kinds of protein interactions, Katrina was able to identify the mechanism for a protein that is responsible for supplying our brain with energy.
The mutations cause something like a signal that wasn't there before and is recognized by other proteins, and it tells these other proteins, take me and bring me to a different place. But this signal isn't supposed to be there, so they are brought to a place that they actually don't belong to, and that makes them non-functional.
And you can imagine the problem that this causes. Our brain doesn't get the energy that it needs just because this protein was delivered to the wrong address.
And then I looked at the whole screen again, and I found 2 more. So I was like, oh, this seems to be a pattern. There's not just 1, there are 3 that have the same kind of motif and the same kind of story behind. And then it became like a bigger thing. So that was what made it really cool.
While Katrina's work deals with biologic and molecular processes, our next winner is researching brain architecture. At Forschungszentrum Jülich, Miriam Menzel and a group are working on reconstructing the 3-dimensional nerve fiber pathways of our human brain.
So we cut the brain into micrometer-thin sections and place these sections in a polarization microscope. And from the measured intensity changes, we then get information about the 3D orientations of the nerve fibers. But in certain brain regions, such as crossing fibers, here for example, we still misinterpret our results. So here the signal cancels out and we only get a low intensity signal. And this is of course a big problem if you want to reconstruct the nerve fiber architecture of the brain. And therefore, in my thesis, I developed new techniques that give us additional information about brain tissue properties. And I performed numerical simulations on our supercomputers to study how the light of the microscope interacts with the brain tissue using artificial nerve fiber models. And I found, for example, that the scattering of the light gives us valuable additional information, such as the crossing angle of the nerve fibers, which was not accessible so far.
Wow, so basically the information that you found, it was always there, but you found a way to unlock it.
Yeah, right.
Cool. So Miriam's thesis helps us to understand in more detail how the different parts of our brain are interconnected. Also working with light is Ijen. She's researching how the electrons around large atoms interact with high-intensity light. And this is me trying to understand the quantum physics behind it.
It's very weird when I think about this. Everything is so small, and then you give the length scales, like a million times smaller than the human hair size, and then it moves so fast, it's on the time scale of a billion of a second. So how do you know what is going on? So you use light.
So together with experimentalists, she exposed large atoms to ultra-short bursts of light to record the electron motion that was set off by the really intense laser. And what they found is that the electrons were not always being flung out of their orbit through the expected quantum tunneling mechanism. Instead, sometimes they oscillated or danced around the atom before returning back into orbit, which seems so unusual somehow.
So what this study shows is that the interactions between light and matters in this kind of extreme conditions is far more complicated than what we imagined before.
I understand what you say, but I'm not quite sure if it reaches my brain.
Yeah, when I say to my grandma, I just say I study how the material interact with big lasers. Like
yeah. And she says, yeah, I understand.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
So while Ijen makes really small and fast things visible, Anita's research at the German Aerospace Center is based on making really loud things quieter by designing acoustic liners, for instance to cover the insides of airplane engines.
Acoustic liners are perforated walls, so we have a screen with small perforations in it, and there's a backing cavity behind the wall. And those cavities, together with the holes, they form Helmholtz resonators, and by adjusting the geometry of the system, you can determine a special sound absorption frequency range. So this is our flow duct. This is where we measure actually the performance of the liner. Our goal is to match the absorption spectrum of those liners to the spectrum of the noise.
Now, this is something that can be done by trial and error, but the scientific and more efficient approach is to model the situation. However,
we found out that in each case the older models are not correct.
Because not only the oscillating flow in the individual openings, but also the interaction in between openings have been oversimplified.
And this is where my research starts. I'm developing a model where this complicated sound and flow interaction in the openings of the liner is predicted correctly.
So this way, Anita is contributing to making our future world a bit less noisy. Now, my next stop is also going to be at the German Aerospace Center, but this time in Köln, where I'll meet Josua.
So I'm working on taking the energy of the sun and using it for chemistry, basically.
And for that, he needs perovskites, metal oxide compounds that have different properties depending on how they're combined.
And it's basically like playing Lego, like putting different metals together, and if you do it the right way, you get a new perovskite in a specific crystal structure, and you can design those perovskites in such a way that they react exactly like you want them to.
Now, it's possible to design them in a lab, but that takes a lot of time and effort.
So that's why my approach was to teach the computer how this is done, how the chemistry and physics work, to have the computer calculate a lot of materials and then find the ideal material out of this big data set. And to do that, I worked together with people in Berkeley in the United States who really know how to do this. And together we created an online database where any chemist or physicist or engineer can find a material for the right application, and it's completely for free and online and available to everyone.
From chemical engineering, we now jump to wildlife conservation. Annegret studied the impact of climate change on reptile populations in Australia by observing and counting them and by evaluating their behavior and conditions.
We should definitely leave the local vegetation in the national parks, definitely, but also through the farms as like stepping stones to make it possible for the species to move between habitats, because that's what many desert species do. They follow the rainfall.
The thing is, certain habitats can be dry for years before the next rainfall, so the reptiles need to be able to migrate in between habitats.
If we would remove vegetation and they couldn't move on the bare ground because it's too hot, it would cause local extinctions.
Now that she's back in Germany, she's studying local amphibians and using a somewhat unconventional method.
Yes, I have something new. What I'm using is a specific detection dog. So I'm searching the area with the dog. The dog is trained on the newt species, and it would alert whenever he finds a newt species or a newt refuge.
That way she's able to map the refuges, maybe even find the individuals and measure the microhabitat conditions. And it's quite obvious how much the two of them enjoy this fieldwork. But then there's also this other side of science.
I like correlating things with each other, trying to figure out why something is as it is. And then to see results and to see reasons and to get the puzzle together and understand why something happened, this is it's just a great experience in the end.
And this kind of enthusiasm for science is something that all 6 candidates have in common. Annegret, Ijen, Josua, Katrina, Anita and Miriam, congratulations on winning the 2019 Helmholtz Doctoral Prize.